What we strive for in this country is to become informed by hearing different viewpoints. The ability to speak to a congressman and actually get involved makes a lot more difference than a lot of people believe.
I wanted to focus on a book that actually came out 2 years ago, which has the title Crushed, Big Tech's War on Free Speech. I bought it at the time, and then I saw it on my shelf the other day. I thought, I would love now to come back to this for a couple of reasons, because now former member of Congress Ken Buck is not there, so he might have some things to say. Not that it's ever been difficult to get him to express an opinion, but more importantly, now that we're starting to see some of these individuals from big tech going to the inauguration, making it sound like maybe they've actually begun to believe in free speech. I'd love to get his thoughts about that as well. So we go to former Congressman Ken Buck, an individual that represented the 4th Congressional District in the state of Colorado. He decided this time last year not to seek a 6th House term. He in the past had served as the district attorney in Colorado. He's a graduate of Princeton, actually was one of the football players there on the Princeton Tigers, and an individual that has been certainly an individual speaking out for free speech and liberty, part of the Freedom Caucus. And so, Congressman Ken Buck, welcome to Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. It's good to be with you.
Again, I would love to get your thoughts initially just about your decision to step down, because I remember you had this time last year, some pretty strong statements to make. And I know that you usually make those whether you're in Congress or not. But now looking back, and even as we go through your book, we're going to talk about censorship and the deep state and everything. I'd love to get your reflections on what it was like to have served in Congress and some of the things you uncovered that I think our listeners need to know.
Well, I have to tell you, it was an honor to serve. It wasn't exactly what I thought it was going to be when I signed up for it, or when the voters signed me up for it, I guess. But it's an honor. It is an extremely dysfunctional place. The idea that we have existential threats in this country that Congress will not address because it's not in their political interest to address those is very difficult to deal with. And I really felt like I could make a difference the first few years I was there, and tried my hardest. But at some point in time, it just doesn't make sense to continue being there. And it is a sacrifice in a lot of ways, traveling every week, and the stress and hours and everything. But the idea that we have, I don't even know what the debt is now, 34 trillion, 35 trillion. Doesn't really matter at some point. And Congress won't address that. It won't address the fact that we don't need to just slow down the rate of spending. We need to actually cut back on spending.
I know. And again, I think we're up to 36 trillion, but what's a few trillion among friends? I mean, this is just ridiculous. And the fact that you cannot pass a budget, although I'll give credit, sometimes the House would, but never does that happen in the Senate. And so anything that we require 50 states to do, trying to have at least a balanced budget, the federal government just says, oh, we'll just keep printing money. And then, of course, as you point out, the existential threats that come from Russia, from China, from a variety of other sources that we can talk about, of the immigration issue, and on and on. I sense your frustration and the frustration of many people in the Freedom Caucus. So certainly we can get into that as well. But I thought one of the reasons I wanted to do this is I do recommend this book to individuals. Even though it's been out for a while, we have a link in case you can't find it in your local bookstore, since it's been out for 2 years. Crushed, Big Tech's War on Free Speech. But you spend some time really helping us understand that if you believe in free speech, there are these major companies, and we'll give them the name, Google, Facebook, Twitter, now called X, Amazon, Apple, that were so involved in censoring information. And you lived through the time of the pandemic and the lockdown, and they used to talk about disinformation, but it does seem to me, Congressman, that the biggest source of disinformation oftentimes was the federal government, and number two was social media. Your thoughts?
No doubt about it. And I have to tell you something. It's clear, as you mentioned earlier, that these giants have now shown up at the inauguration and are kissing the ring, doing major donations to President Trump. But it doesn't really matter whether someone censors free speech from the right or the left, or changes their policies for a year or two because Congress is controlled by Republicans and we have a Republican in the White House. If we allow censorship in this country, if we allow major companies to censor our speech and to limit our speech, and then we're happy when they limit the other side, understand that in a few years it's going to come back at us again. And the real problem with these companies is they're monopolies, and there's no competition in the marketplace for them. And so that's how that is the answer to the question of what do we do with these companies. But you're absolutely right. They have censored in the past, and they will censor in the future unless we do something about it.
I'm going to get into maybe the deep weeds for a minute, because part of that gets back to the Communications Decency Act. And, of course, you talk about that, Section 230, what that might mean as well. And it seems to me that there are some things that can and should be done. And your point's well taken, because you open up with a story about actually doing some exercise and noticing over on the right-hand side as you're actually working out that your face is there because you were being listed. And, of course, we've seen that before as the most evil man in America. And, of course, you at least said, well, that's what we have when we have free speech. But the bottom line is it's been amazing to me to see that whether it's Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, when they were concerned about big oligopolies or monopolies, but when they were doing the bidding of them, no, it wasn't any problem. But now when it's starting to go the other way, you have speeches by, for example, outgoing President Joe Biden warning about oligarchs. Well, they liked the oligarchs when they were on their side, but all of a sudden when Elon Musk buys Twitter and it becomes X, that's a little bit different. But let's go back, if we could, Ken, just for a few minutes to talk about this idea of monopoly. And one of the many things I learned out of your book is that even Thomas Jefferson and, of course, James Madison were concerned about monopoly, and I never really kind of realized that. I remember the debate about whether or not we needed to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution, which we did. And the First Amendment, of course, guarantees the freedom of press, the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and all sorts of other things. But it reminds me of the fact that even though you say the word monopoly is not in the Constitution, there's kind of an anti-monopoly idea in the Constitution, isn't there?
There is. It was one of the most interesting things that I found in researching the book was the East India Company. The Boston Tea Party was a protest against the taxation, but also the idea that the East India Company was granted a monopoly over tea in the colonies. And this monopoly was being used in ways to increase prices and decrease competition. And so it was fascinating how so much of what we're taught at a very superficial level in grade school, junior high, really, when you start peeling back the onion, it gets much more interesting, at least to me, seeing how monopolies operated with our founders. But our founders were very definitely opposed to monopolies, and they believed that the democratically elected republic that they had set up would prohibit monopolies just by the way they had set up the republic. So there was no need to put anything about monopolies in our Constitution, because everybody could see right on its face that this country was a country where we wanted to break down the barriers to success.
And again, this was of concern back then. They would be concerned if one company owned all the printing presses in the 18th century. And of course, now we have the internet. But when you have Google controlling more than 90% of the searches, Facebook obtaining personal data of 3.6 billion users, and then, of course, now with AI showing up even in our computers, and they're taking screen grabs and all sorts of other things, we are in a world where we would never allow for, say, Exxon to have a complete monopoly over oil production, and yet we certainly right now allow some of these big tech companies to have an incredible monopoly in this area of free speech and censorship, correct?
Absolutely correct. And we had a period in our country's history where we went through an industrial revolution, and as a result of that new economy, there were certain monopolies that sprung up, and we Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act and other anti-monopoly laws to deal with that. But now we've changed and we've grown in ways that we could never envision with the Sherman Antitrust Act. But we've changed our economy to this digital economy, and I can, you just think of my grandmother. I can remember sitting and watching a man walking on the moon with my grandmother on TV, and my grandmother crossed the plains in a covered wagon.
Wow!
And that's a tremendous change in her lifetime. We've had even greater changes in our lifetime with the digital economy, and so the fact that our founders were opposed to monopolies, and we've suffered through inefficiencies and price gains and unfair accumulation of wealth in the Industrial Revolution. Now we see that even more in this digital economy, and that's why it's so important to address these monopolies.
Let's we can talk about, and I don't want to get into the deep weeds too much, but the Communications Decency Act, because as you point out, this was an attempt at the time to recognize with this growing internet that we wanted to provide some protection for platforms. And I'll make a distinction between platforms and an editorial place. If, for example, in the town square where everybody is listening right now, anywhere across the country, they set up a microphone. It's a free speech platform, and anybody can say anything, and you should not be allowed to sue the park or the individual who put the microphone up there because it's a free speech platform. That's a little different, though, if you are like the Washington Post or the New York Times, and you're determining what gets to be on the editorial page or the op-ed page and what is not. And I think the original idea is that, well, these are going to be platforms, but as the censorship began to grow, it seems to me that they were no longer platforms, but they were like the editorial page of newspapers. Your thoughts?
Yeah, there's this very vague language that was placed in that, and it had to do with harm. This general idea of these platforms will be able to take material off if it would cause harm. And the problem is that one person's view is much different than another person's view. And so these left of center organizations, mostly operating on the left coast of the United States, decided that they were going to censor conservative speech. And what they ended up doing was using this Section 230 subsection to accomplish that. Kerby, it reminds me of something that I was involved in Congress, and that was the AI debates. And we just don't know what AI is going to look like. And so we're trying to enact laws. We're trying to encourage the executive branch to enact regulations. But until we're 10 years down the road, we don't know what it looks like. The problem with Section 230 is they never went and amended it as they learned more and more about the internet and about digital economy. And so it just doesn't serve the needs of the people right now as it was structured years and years ago.
Well, and again, that brings us back to something you said before. You might say, well, why didn't they amend it? It seems to be almost impossible to get anything through Congress anymore, and I know that was part of the frustration that you felt, which finally caused your departure, because if you can't pass a bill, you can't pass a budget, and you can't even amend something that's always doing or seems to be doing a great deal of harm, we're kind of stuck with the circumstances that we enacted a long time ago before we have the kind of information we have today.
Absolutely. And the dysfunction in Congress is hurting us in areas like this. And smart people, and Jeff Bezos and others, they're incredibly smart, and they understand business and they understand human nature, and they have built these huge companies, Google and Facebook, Twitter, Amazon, Apple, all huge companies that were built by very smart, hardworking people but the ability to innovate in this country has decreased as a result of these monopolies. And so Congress has to take action.
A number of years ago, I wrote this book on a biblical view on social media. One half of it was about this whole issue of censorship. But then we thought more recently we would actually do an entire one on this issue of censorship. You can see here it has Mark Zuckerberg, but we could put Elon Musk or anybody else up there because this whole issue of censorship, very significant. And even though on certain issues we might find ourselves disagreeing with Professor Jonathan Turley, his new book, Indispensable Right, Free Speech in an Age of Rage, very good book that we recommend, which is part of that. So those are two resources. But before we're done, I think we'll also be spending some time talking with former Congressman Ken Buck about this. This is the booklet I did on the deep state. This is really kind of the big issue right now in Congress. It is certainly the whole issue of the Department of, again, government efficiency, what's called DOGE, and also whether or not we can really bring about some of the kind of changes that need to take place. And there's a whole chapter in this book on that as well. And certainly one of the things, Ken, that surfaces time and time again is the issue of disinformation and misinformation. And I make the distinction, but I'd love to get your thoughts about misinformation. Let's go back to maybe the pandemic. When we didn't know everything about the virus, certainly you could say some of that was just misinformation. The idea that a mask would protect you from getting the virus. Well, we had some doubts about that then. We knew some were good, better, and best, but nothing is perfect. And or even that once you get the vaccine, you won't get the virus. And that turned out not to be true as well. And I put some of that, at least initially, into misinformation because we didn't know what we didn't know. Later on, I think it got into disinformation where it was deliberate. But a good example of disinformation is almost from the outset. People knew that this virus that came from Wuhan didn't come from a wet market. We knew that it came from the Wuhan Institute of Technology. And we now have the emails knowing that there was a deliberate attempt to mislead the people. And if anybody that would actually want to challenge some of the things I just mentioned, they were getting deplatformed. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why you decided to write the book.
Yeah, absolutely. The idea that in this country, false speech can be taken offline is just crazy. And in fact, much of what was taken offline as false speech was true. And the only way to deal with false speech is to provide more true speech. These people who think they're smarter than everybody else and they can censor people are wrong. We've seen it happen over and over again with, as you mentioned, the origins of COVID. Certainly in the political realm, we saw many intelligence officials, former intelligence officials, talk about the fact that the Hunter Biden laptop was a Russian plant in some way, and that was just nonsense. And that speech wasn't taken offline, even though it was false. And so people who are the judges who sit there and say, I know better than everybody else, I know what's false and I know what's true, that's never been the way this country has worked. We've always addressed false speech with more speech.
Well, and again, one of the sections you have in your book is the unfair town square. Our argument has always been in a town square, and again, I use the example, just go to a local park. I've been on some free speech platforms over the years. I'm sure you have as well. They put up a microphone, anybody can say anything. And if you the person before you said some really crazy things, maybe conspiracy theories, things are just factually incorrect. Even today, I have a quote in my commentary from an individual that oftentimes made the very profound perspective, that is Daniel Patrick Moynihan, that everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. And so the best way to counter bad speech or inaccurate speech is more speech. And that has really been the idea of free speech going back centuries before us. And all of a sudden, we found ourselves in a situation where a few individuals in big tech, sometimes an algorithm, in other cases, somebody who's just graduated from college who has a leftist perspective, would then begin to censor individuals that have medical degrees, have expertise in those areas. And that, of course, is one of the reasons why we need to be very vigilant, because if that were to continue any longer, then we really would be engaged in a great deal of disinformation, wouldn't we?
Yeah, we would, and it's a great point, because what we strive for in this country is to become informed by hearing different viewpoints. In politics, it's a little bit different. What we want to do in politics is I shouldn't say we, but what happens in politics is one side will try to put out negative information about the other side's candidate and positive information about their own candidate. And the side with more resources hopes to win with that simple strategy. Well, now that political strategy moved to the White House with President Biden, and the Biden administration were telling these monopolies, well, you can't allow anybody to say that, because that's just disinformation. And of course, much of what was being said was true, but they were trying to shut down opposing views, and that's dangerous again.
One of the other things I want to just focus on is later one of your chapters talks about how Amazon, and you just pick on them, but you can pick on some others, monopoly abuses and destroys competition, innovation, and free speech, because there's an issue even bigger than speech in some ways, although this free speech is one of the most valuable issues in the book. But another one is there are innovations, and yet when you are so large, for example, like Microsoft or Apple, or you're so large like Amazon or Google, you can stifle a lot of innovation, and some of the best ideas and much of the job growth comes from the small businesses and from the entrepreneurs and the creative inventors, right?
Absolutely right. One of the things Amazon has been found to have done in India and in other countries, and I certainly heard the stories from small businesses here, is a small business will place something on the Amazon website to sell. Amazon will see on its website that product is selling like crazy. They'll go and replicate the product.
Yes.
And there may be patent violations, maybe trademark violations, maybe other violations. Amazon's so big that they can deal with the lawsuits, and these small companies go out of business. And what the result of that is that investors don't want to invest in a company that will cross Amazon, because the company ultimately will go out of business. They'll lose their investment. So it really has impacted innovation in this country.
Well, and again, that's a concern as well, because even when they do get charged, and we've seen this with banks, and we've seen this with big tech and a number of others, they'll pay the fine, and it's just sort of the cost of doing business because they're so large. And again, as a businessman now and as an individual that probably has always supported small business, I just hate to see it whenever good creative ideas, small businesses, entrepreneurs, inventors get crushed. And so that was just another significant chapter that I just thought we might mention there as well. But I did want to leave a little bit of time, because one of your chapters is about the swamp. And again, I'll hold up our booklet on the deep state. A couple of years ago, Ken, we'd had people saying, this idea of the deep state, well, that's just a conspiracy theory. These are individuals that are really upset about that, and they're just a bunch of QAnon conspiratorial people and all that. And then just as Joe Biden was getting into office, about ready to actually become the next president 4 years ago, there was an interesting article in the Washington Post saying, well, will the deep state of Trump affect Biden? I thought, all of a sudden now everybody realizes there's a deep state and there's a swamp. And you've been there perhaps longer than many other people. I'd love to get your thoughts, because we hear people talk about the swamp. It's no longer seen as a conspiracy theory, but it certainly has such a profound impact on our culture, whether you call it the administrative state, whether you call it the deep state, or whether you just simply call it the swamp. And I'd love to get your perspective on how influential that is in the past and how might influential it will be now, as there's an attempt by Donald Trump to bring about some of these changes.
Well, I'll tell you, Kerby, first book I wrote was called Drain the Swamp. and it was all
Right.
about the deep state before
Yeah.
the term deep state became popular. But the bureaucracy in this country has stifled Republicans and Democrats for well over a century. It is nothing new, and it will do its very best to prevent President Trump from implementing his agenda, just like it did with President Biden, just like it did with President Trump before, and President Bush, President Obama. It is set up in a way that, and everybody says, well, who's in charge of it? It's created these little kingdoms in all the different agencies. So if you're trying to get a gun permit for an automatic weapon, the ATF has its own little kingdom set up, and they will try to stifle any change that occurs in that area. The same in the healthcare area, the same in just every area across the board. And so it's nothing new, but I really compliment President Trump for taking on the deep state and making changes to it.
One of the questions I suspect, Ken, people have is what can we do? And of course, you have a whole chapter there which people can read, but one of those is to look for some alternatives. We don't have to send our good, hard-earned money to various individuals who are actually providing a service, search engines, shopping, video, streaming, all sorts of things. Necessarily, we can look for alternatives, can't we?
Absolutely. There are alternatives to online shopping, and it doesn't hurt to get in a car and drive to the supermarket and see some friends every once in a while. The idea that we expect everything to be delivered overnight with this one-day delivery service, I can remember the days where we used to plan. Oh, I'm low on honey today. I've got to get some, whatever the paper towels, whatever it is, we can plan and get those things and avoid the trap of how these monopolies and look, these monopolies do great things. It's not that they're delivering an inferior product. But Google is another one. Google very definitely changed its algorithm to hurt President Trump in 2016, and people continue to use Google. They make a lot of money off of the searches that you conduct on Google. So use a different platform, a platform that doesn't track you. And then there are tracking devices on all these. So on your phone, turn off the tracking devices so they can't track you, and they don't make as much money off of your information.
Yes. Well, that brings us to another issue. I guess I could hold up our booklet on digital surveillance, because you also talk about change your settings. And I've become more aware of the fact that now some of these computers, the newer computers, some of these newer phones have AI in them, but they also have a way of tracking you. Even if your phone is off, it can track you. And so everything from maybe getting a VPN, talking about turn off some of the tracking devices, and just be aware that Big Brother is actually watching you, and it isn't necessarily Big Brother in government. It's actually Big Brother through big tech, who then sends that information on to the big government. Is that true?
It's absolutely true. And let me tell you something, Kerby. I think the big brother in the monopolies is even more dangerous than the big brother in government.
Agreed.
The monopolies don't have a constitution that limits them in the courts, and the government does. Now, it doesn't always follow the Constitution, and we need to go to court to protect ourselves, and the courts are a great avenue for the most part to protect us. But these monopolies aren't limited. They can absolutely censor you. So the only way to change that is to have 5 Facebooks and 5 Googles, and make sure that there's competition, so that they don't take actions that are really, I think, un-American. I think when we are being tracked like we are, it's just not the way our founders intended this country to be set up.
For sure. And it does seem to me that the other action item is something we talk about all the time, and that is get involved. We have, of course, a take action item right at the moment, the take action item is where you can contact your two senators about encouraging them to approve the cabinet officers for Donald Trump. But we've had other action items that get into such issues as privacy and security, and also to really maybe start asking some fundamental questions of candidates. I know it's hard to imagine, but some are already starting to gear up for the next set of elections. But where do they stand on those issues? And what kind of ideas do they believe need to be addressed? Because we cannot just continue to step back and assume that big tech is going to do whatever it wants without at least some kind of oversight. So it seems to me that as an individual that's run for office, you are well aware of the fact that paying attention to not only your elected officials, but start to pay attention even to possible candidates who are standing for freedom and are the kind of people that could actually join the Freedom Caucus.
That's absolutely right. And Kerby, I, on a number of occasions, held town hall meetings. Someone got up to speak. I asked my staff about the issue. You know, the staff is dealing with 1,000 issues. I think there's 4,500 bills that are introduced in the House every year. And yet someone stands up and they make an impassioned plea, and I ask my staff about it. I look into it, and we start to become a leader on the issue in Congress. The ability to speak to a congressman and actually get involved makes a lot more difference than a lot of people believe.
And again, like we said, of course, there's the need to make sure you're registered to vote. But one of the reasons we have a section in addition to my Viewpoints commentary that we have up there is the take action item. And we'll be changing that out very soon. And it's just trying to make it as easy as possible for people to get involved because, again, the Constitution says we the people. And I do sense that some of this is changing. If nothing else, Ken, more recently, I think of some people I've had on the program, which on many issues I would disagree with them. I'm thinking of Alan Dershowitz we've had on the program, or even Nadine Strawson, who was the head of the ACLU, but stands up for this idea of free speech. And I'm even seeing some individuals who identify themselves as liberals criticizing the left for trying to censor. So I do believe some things are coming in our direction, and that's why I wanted to get your thoughts today about Big Tech's war on free speech and encourage people to get that book and maybe even contact you and find out more about the kinds of things that we can do as private citizens, because I believe that you're still going to have an influence, maybe a more significant influence now that you're outside of Congress.
Well, I very much appreciate the time with you, Kerby, and I hope people do read the book and take to heart the idea that they are in control of their lives. And if enough people act, these companies will change their way. Other companies will come up and create competition. And just like our election system, it is one person at a time that makes a difference.
Well, again, thank you for being with us. I've certainly followed your career, and I'm kind of glad I saw the book on my shelf and pulled it up and said, you know what, let's see, Steve, if we could get former Congressman Ken Buck on the program, and you did not disappoint. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Going to take a break, and again, I've mentioned a few booklets, but one I'd like to make available to you is this one on censorship. It came out in November, and it talks about different aspects of censorship, but I also tried to help you think about, well, what does the Bible say about free speech? And there are some verses and even some, if you will, biblical principles and some history of Western civilization that might be helpful to you to think about this issue. And so if you're dealing with the issue of censorship, these are booklets, of course, that we send out to our donors. And if you give $1 a day, $30 a month, these come automatically to you along with our Outlook magazine. And that's another reason why you may want to consider supporting Point of View, because we send these out on a regular basis. Got the one here, social media, one on digital censorship, one on deep state, and of course we have ones coming out almost every month on some different topic that you might be interested in. So again, you can find out more about supporting this ministry by clicking on that banner that says Biblical Clarity in Cultural Chaos. Those of you that get the Outlook know that we're going to be talking this year about Anchored in Truth, so you can see that there as well. Thanks for joining us, and I hope you, again, have appreciated all that we've talked about today. And don't forget that if you would like more information about what we're talking about, you can find it at the website pointofview.net. That's all we have for today. We look forward to seeing you next time right here on Point of View Highlights.